There is an empire whose royal lineage was deliberately erased. Not by the passage of time, not by the ordinary entropy that blurs the historical record across centuries, but by a systematic campaign carried out within a generation of the conquest that specifically targeted the Inca elite, the administrators, the priests, the keepers of the quipu records, the people who carried the knowledge of who the Sapa Inca were and where they came from. The Spanish who arrived in 1532 under Francisco Pizarro did not simply conquer the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. They understood with a colonial precision that is genuinely impressive in its thoroughness that destroying the genealogical memory of the ruling class was essential to making the conquest permanent. Burn the quipus, destroy the mummies, execute the nobles who might organize resistance, and rewrite, through the accounts of Spanish chroniclers who had every incentive to tell the story in ways that served the colonial order, the history of what had existed before. It almost worked. What the Spanish did not account for was the DNA. The Inca Empire at its height, in the early 16th century, was an extraordinary achievement by any measure. At its maximum extent, it stretched from what is today southern Colombia to central Chile, encompassing a north-south distance of over 4,000 kilometers along the Andes mountain chain. It contained an estimated population of between 9 and 12 million people at the time of Spanish contact, organized through one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in the pre-modern world. The Inca did not use writing in the conventional sense, but they used the quipu, a system of knotted strings that encoded numerical and possibly narrative information with a complexity that researchers have only recently begun to decipher. They built roads, thousands of kilometers of engineered stone road connecting every corner of the empire to its capital Cusco, maintained by a relay runner system, the chasqui, who could carry a message or a package the length of the empire in days, whose speed was such that fresh fish from the Pacific coast could reach the Inca court in the highlands within 48 hours. They built Machu Picchu, the most celebrated archaeological site in the Western Hemisphere, a complex whose precise alignment with astronomical events, whose terracing of an impossibly steep mountain ridge, and whose engineering of water collection and distribution systems in terrain, where almost nothing should have been buildable, still generates genuine scholarly astonishment and has never been fully explained in terms of the technology available to its builders. They developed agricultural techniques suited to the extreme altitude conditions of the Andes, including the terrace farming systems that still define the visual landscape of the Peruvian highlands and the freeze-drying of potatoes at altitude that produce chuño, a preserved food that could be stored for years and distributed across the empire's vast road network. They organized labor through the Mita system, a form of tax paid in work rather than goods that mobilized the population for construction projects, agricultural labor, and military service in ways that required administrative sophistication, far beyond anything their Spanish conquerors brought with them. And then, in 1532, 168 Spanish soldiers under Pizarro captured the Sapa Inca Atahualpa at the city of Cajamarca, executed him after he provided a ransom of gold and silver that filled a room to the height a man could reach with his arm extended. And the empire that had taken a century to build began to come apart with a speed that has surprised historians ever since. The speed of the conquest has always required explanation. 168 men against an army of thousands. Historians have focused on the military technology, the horses that the Andean populations had never seen, the steel armor and firearms, the psychological shock of the encounter. But the genetics are now providing a different kind of explanation, one that does not replace the military account, but supplements it with a biological dimension that the chronicles never captured. The Inca Empire was weakened before Pizarro arrived. Not by military failure, by disease. The smallpox epidemic that had devastated Mesoamerica after the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire spread southward along trade routes ahead of any European soldier, reaching the Andes perhaps a decade before Pizarro's arrival. The epidemic killed, by some estimates, between 30 and 50% of the Andean population. It killed the previous Sapa Inca Huayna Capac and two of his designated heirs. And it triggered the civil war between Atahualpa and his half-brother Huascar that was still being fought when the Spanish arrived, a war that left the empire politically fractured and militarily exhausted at the precise moment the conquistadors appeared. When researchers began analyzing ancient DNA from Inca-period burials in the Andes, the first thing they found was confirmation of what the demographic historians had long argued. The pre-contact Andean populations showed a specific genetic profile, the product of thousands of years of population history in the Americas. With deep roots in the founding migrations that had crossed the Bering Land Bridge at the end of the Pleistocene, and then spread southward through the Americas across tens of thousands of years. The Andean populations carried haplogroups and ancestry components consistent with that long history, including the distinctive signatures of populations that had adapted over many generations to the specific biological challenges of high-altitude life. Reduced oxygen availability, cold temperatures, and the particular agricultural ecology of the Andean highlands. What the ancient DNA studies of the colonial and post-colonial periods showed was something more dramatic and more specific. The population collapse that followed the Spanish conquest was not simply large. It was, in biological terms, catastrophic in ways that left permanent marks in the genetic profile of the populations that survived. Studies estimating the population of the Andes before and after Spanish contact have concluded that the indigenous population declined by somewhere between 70 and 90% within a century of the conquest. Through a combination of epidemic disease, violence, forced labor in the silver mines, and the general disruption of the agricultural and social systems that had sustained the Andean population for millennia. The genetics confirm this collapse in a specific and measurable way. Modern Andean populations show levels of genetic diversity that are significantly lower than what pre-contact ancient DNA samples suggest was present before the conquest. The bottleneck is visible. The reduction in population was severe enough and rapid enough to narrow the genetic variation of the surviving population in ways that are still detectable today in the DNA of people living in the same mountain communities that existed before Pizarro arrived. But here is where the genetics become genuinely surprising, because buried within the ancient DNA data from Inca-period sites, researchers have found something that the colonial record had systematically obscured. The genetic profiles of individuals associated with the Inca elite, people buried with the markers of high status, show specific ancestry patterns that distinguish them from the broader Andean population in ways that point to their origins in the specific region of the southern Andes, where the Inca oral tradition itself placed the beginning of the dynasty. The Inca claimed divine descent from the sun god Inti, and maintained through the institution of royal incest. The Sapa Inca married his sister to keep the royal bloodline pure. A degree of genetic isolation within the elite that the DNA is now beginning to document. The royal mummies that the Spanish destroyed, the wrapped bodies of the previous Sapa Incas that the Inca people brought out for festivals and consulted as living presences in the political life of the empire, carried genetic information that would have been invaluable for understanding the dynasty's origins and structure. Most of that information is gone. The mummies were destroyed. The bodies were burned or buried in unmarked locations. The genetic record of the royal lineage was, as the Spanish intended, largely erased, but not entirely, because some individuals of high Inca status were buried rather than mummified, and some of those burials survived. And the DNA extracted from those burials is beginning to show what the Spanish tried to prevent from being knowable. A lineage with specific and traceable origins in the Cusco region and its surrounding highlands, a lineage that shows the genetic signature of the systematic endogamy the Inca practiced, and a lineage whose descendants are present in the modern Andean population in ways that the colonial period could disrupt, but not eliminate. The modern Quechua-speaking populations of Peru and Bolivia, the communities who maintain the language and many of the cultural practices of the Inca period, despite 5 centuries of colonial pressure, carry in their mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages the genetic legacy of a civilization that the Spanish tried very hard to make permanently unknowable. The DNA was the part of that civilization that colonial policy could not reach. It passed from parent to child through the epidemic years, and the mine labor, and the forced resettlements, and the suppression of the Quechua language in favor of Spanish, through every year of the long colonial project. And it is still there in the highlands. In the genetic profiles of people who have been living at altitude above 3,000 meters for so long that their bodies show the specific physiological adaptations that distinguish them from every other human population on Earth. The Inca Empire was never simply what the Spanish chroniclers described. It was never simply a barbaric tyranny swept aside by a more advanced civilization. It was an administrative achievement of genuine sophistication, a political system that had solved the problem of governing a population of millions across 4,000 kilometers of some of the most extreme terrain on Earth, using technologies of social organization and information management that the Spanish, who destroyed it, were not capable of fully understanding. The DNA is now allowing us to begin reading what the quipus encoded, and what the mummies remembered, and what the chronicles deliberately omitted, not completely, not yet. The erasure was too thorough, and the recovery tools still too limited for a full reconstruction of what was lost. But the genetic record of the Andean population, the haplogroups that trace back to the founding migrations, the bottleneck signatures of the colonial catastrophe, the specific ancestry patterns of the Inca elite, is telling a story that the Spanish tried to make permanently untellable, and the people who carry that story in their cells, the Quechua speakers in the mountain communities above Cusco and across the Sacred Valley, the Aymara farmers at the shore of Lake Titicaca, whose language and culture predate the Inca conquest of their region, the millions of Peruvians and Bolivians and Ecuadorians and Chileans who trace part of their ancestry to the people who built and inhabited the largest pre-Columbian empire in the Americas, are the living proof that the erasure was never complete. The quipus were burned, the mummies were destroyed, the royal lineage was dismantled with colonial thoroughness, but the DNA passed through everything. It survived the epidemic years, the mine labor, the forced resettlements, the language suppression, the 5 centuries of a colonial order designed to make the Inca past as inaccessible as possible. It is still there in the highlands, at altitude, in the bodies of people who have been living above 3,000 meters for long enough that their physiology is measurably different from the physiology of everyone else on Earth. The Inca Empire tried to be remembered through its mummies and its quipus, and its roads and its temples. The Spanish tried to make it forgotten. The DNA settled the argument without knowing there was one. It remembered everything.